It was the first week of June, and the neighborhood pool shimmered under the sun like a blue promise of summer joy. Families were unpacking floats, sunscreen, and laughter after a long winter, ready to enjoy what they had all paid for: community amenities. But that year, something was different. On the gate of the pool hung a new laminated sign printed in bold, heartless letters: "No minors under 16 allowed without adult supervision." Below it, scribbled hastily in pen, someone had added, "Children under 12 strictly prohibited." At first, the parents thought it was a joke. But when the security guard, a retiree named Dennis who volunteered for the HOA, started turning kids away, confusion turned to anger. The HOA board, led by a self-important woman named Margaret, had apparently decided that children were too disruptive and that the pool was becoming unmanageable. They framed it as a safety measure, but everyone knew what it really was: a way to keep the grown-up residents comfortable at the expense of the families who made up half the community. One father, Daniel Foster, stood quietly among the frustrated parents that day. His two young daughters, Emily and Grace, held their towels and floaties, confused about why they couldn't swim. Daniel promised them ice cream instead, but as he walked home his mind was racing. The rule wasn't just unfair, it was illegal. Daniel was an attorney. Not just any attorney, a community and civil rights lawyer who had spent his career ensuring that ordinary people weren't trampled by people in power. And this time, it wasn't some faraway case. It was personal. That night he pulled up the HOA's bylaws, his fingers tracing the dense paragraphs of legal jargon. He'd read these documents before, but now he examined them with surgical precision. And there it was, the clause that gave him everything he needed. All amenities must remain accessible to residents and their legal dependents unless restricted by safety regulations consistent with state or federal law. The HOA's new No Kids rule violated not only their own bylaws but also the Fair Housing Act, which prohibits discrimination based on familial status. The rule was a direct attack on families, and Daniel knew exactly how to fight back. But this wouldn't be easy. HOA boards rarely admitted fault. They thrived on authority, on the illusion of power, and on residents being too tired or too polite to push back. Daniel knew that once he started this battle, it would become a war, one that would expose secrets, politics, and hypocrisy buried beneath the HOA's polished surface. Still, as he looked at the disappointed faces of his daughters that evening, Daniel made up his mind. This wasn't just about swimming. It was about fairness, community, and standing up to those who thought they could rewrite the rules to suit themselves. And so, the battle lines were drawn. Between one determined father and the HOA board that underestimated him. The first step was to gather evidence. The war for the pool and for justice had just begun. The next morning, Daniel began his quiet investigation. While most neighbors grumbled in their driveways or vented on social media, he was methodical, calm, deliberate, and strategic. He knew that emotion wouldn't win this fight. Paperwork would. He started by visiting the HOA's community portal, downloading every meeting minute and policy amendment from the past 2 years. Buried among the dull routine updates, landscaping budgets, parking permits, noise complaints, was the fateful line item: motion passed to restrict pool access to residents 16+ for safety concerns. It had been approved in a closed-door meeting, with only 3 signatures: Margaret, the president, her friend Linda, the treasurer, and a retired man named George, who had once complained about kids splashing too much. There was no community vote, no open forum, no legal review. Just 3 people deciding, unchallenged, that dozens of families no longer deserved to use something they paid for. Daniel smiled grimly. This was exactly what he needed. He printed everything, highlighting every procedural flaw and violation. Then he began recording witness statements, not as interviews, but as written testimonies from fellow parents. One mother wrote about how her son cried when turned away. Another described how the HOA guard embarrassed her by announcing that children are banned now. Each testimony was calm, factual and damning. Within 3 days, Daniel had built a case thicker than the HOA's entire policy binder, but he wasn't ready to strike. Not yet. The HOA's next board meeting was scheduled for the following week, and he intended to make his move there, in front of everyone. Word started to spread quietly through the neighborhood. "Daniel's doing something," people whispered at mailboxes and playgrounds. "He's a lawyer, you know." It wasn't long before the board caught wind of it, too. Margaret sent out a stiffly worded email. "The new pool policy is final. Any concerns should be directed to the board via formal request." It was an attempt to intimidate, but it only emboldened Daniel further. By the time the meeting day arrived, the community room was packed, standing room only. Parents, retirees, teens, and even a few disinterested neighbors who just wanted entertainment showed up. The air buzzed with tension. Margaret opened the meeting with her usual condescending smile, prepared to dismiss complaints and move on. But Daniel was ready. He requested the floor, citing his right as a resident to address policy matters. The board reluctantly agreed, and then, in a calm and measured voice, he began. He outlined the rules' illegality, the board's procedural violations, and the exact sections of law that made their "no kids" rule unenforceable. He spoke like a man used to being ignored by authority, but never defeated by it. As he laid out the facts, murmurs spread across the room. People leaned forward. Phones started recording. By the time he finished, Margaret's smile had faded. Her pen tapped nervously on the desk. Daniel closed his folder and sat down. He didn't need applause, though the room erupted in quiet cheers. He knew this was only the first strike, because while the board could ignore complaints, they couldn't ignore the law, and Daniel was just getting started. The next week was eerily quiet. Too quiet. The HOA board hadn't responded to Daniel's presentation, not publicly, not privately. There was no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, no correction notice, and certainly no apology. But Daniel knew better than to mistake silence for surrender. When petty people in power were cornered, they didn't admit defeat. They doubled down. It began subtly. The HOA newsletter suddenly featured a new reminder section, warning residents about unauthorized gatherings and disruptive meetings held without board approval. A not-so-subtle jab at the community's support for Daniel's cause. Then came a letter, slipped into his mailbox, a formal notice that his backyard shed violated community aesthetic standards and needed to be removed within 10 days. The shed had been there for years, perfectly compliant. But now, apparently, it was an eyesore. Margaret and her board weren't trying to win through reason. They were trying to wear him down with bureaucracy. It was a classic HOA tactic: drown the opposition in paperwork, fines, and intimidation until they gave up. But Daniel wasn't just any homeowner. He had spent years fighting cases exactly like this, where rules were twisted into weapons. Every violation notice, every memo, every attempt to harass him became another piece of evidence for his growing case. Behind the scenes, the tension in the neighborhood was growing. Parents whispered angrily by the mailboxes, while the older residents, those who supported the board, began glaring at families with children. The community was dividing. What had once been a peaceful suburb now felt like a Cold War zone with manicured lawns. Margaret, meanwhile, was unraveling. Her leadership had always relied on control and compliance. But Daniel's calm defiance shook her authority. She began sending long, rambling emails filled with self-justification, claiming the rule was temporary, that it was for insurance reasons, and that Daniel was misrepresenting the board's intentions. Each email contradicted the last, exposing her desperation. Then, in a final act of arrogance, the board posted a new notice on the community bulletin. Effective immediately, all pool access is suspended pending further review. It was punishment disguised as procedure, closing the pool for everyone out of spite. The backlash was instant. Families flooded the HOA inbox with angry messages. Teenagers posted videos on social media mocking the rule. Even longtime residents who had supported the board began to question their judgment. The once proud community was now a battleground of resentment and distrust. Daniel watched it unfold quietly. He didn't want chaos, he wanted accountability. But he knew that the board's latest move had crossed the final line. Temporarily closing the pool wasn't just unfair. It violated the HOA's fiduciary duty to maintain shared amenities for residents' use. That single act gave him everything he needed. He drafted a formal cease and desist letter addressed to the entire board, citing federal law, state statute, and HOA bylaw violations, and warning of legal action if the discriminatory policies were not immediately reversed. The letter was precise, professional, and terrifyingly clear. When the letter arrived in Margaret's inbox, she realized this was no longer a neighborhood argument. It was a legal reckoning, but instead of backing down, she made one final mistake. She went public. At the next board meeting, she accused Daniel of harassment, claiming he was trying to sue the community for personal gain. She underestimated him again, because Daniel wasn't suing the community. He was defending it, and now the gloves were coming off. The HOA had just declared open war, and Daniel was ready to end it. By the time the next HOA meeting arrived, the community's tension was thick enough to feel in the air. The folding chairs in the clubhouse were filled wall to wall. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in months now sat shoulder to shoulder, whispering in anticipation. The families were there to support Daniel. The board loyalists, arms crossed, sat in stony silence. And at the front of the room sat Margaret, rigid, defensive, and visibly shaken beneath her forced composure. Daniel sat quietly in the back, a man with a plan. He wasn't angry. He was patient. For weeks, he had been gathering more than just paperwork. Through his legal contacts and careful requests under state homeowner transparency laws, he had obtained financial records from the HOA. Documents the board never expected anyone to read. And what they revealed was worse than anyone could have imagined. The pool safety upgrades Margaret had cited as justification for banning kids, they didn't exist. The funds allocated for them, nearly $15,000, had been redirected toward landscaping improvements around the board president's private cul-de-sac. Receipts showed new flower beds, decorative stones, and even a small water feature, all paid for with HOA money. Daniel had seen corruption before, but this was arrogance in its purest form. Margaret hadn't just broken the rules, she'd rewritten them for her personal comfort. When the meeting began, she launched into her usual monologue about maintaining order and ensuring the safety of all residents. But Daniel waited until the open forum section, and then, calmly, he stood. Every eye in the room turned toward him. He spoke without notes. His voice was steady, his words precise. He recounted how the board had changed the pool rule without a vote, how they had discriminated against families, and finally, how they had misused HOA funds for personal projects. Each claim was backed by printed evidence, which he handed to the property manager and a few stunned residents. Gasps filled the room as the documents made their way through the crowd. Neighbors who had once defended Margaret now whispered in disbelief. One even stood and demanded answers. Margaret's confident facade began to crack. She stammered something about maintenance projects and necessary upgrades, but her explanations only deepened the hole she was digging. Then came the turning point. Daniel revealed that he had already contacted the state's Department of Consumer Affairs, the office that oversees HOA compliance. They had confirmed that the board's conduct appeared to violate both HOA statute and fiduciary responsibility laws. An official investigation was pending. The room erupted. The residents were done being silenced. Years of resentment poured out. Complaints about unfair fines, selective enforcement, ignored maintenance requests. Everything Margaret had tried to bury came surging to the surface. Daniel stood back, letting the chaos speak for itself. He didn't have to yell. He didn't have to threaten. The truth was louder than anything he could say. As the meeting dissolved into outrage, Margaret abruptly called for adjournment and stormed out, her face pale and tight. The remaining board members looked defeated, their authority collapsing before their eyes. For the first time in years, the homeowners realized they had power. That night, Daniel received a dozen emails from neighbors thanking him, and asking what came next. He knew exactly what to do. The HOA's bylaws allowed for a special vote of no confidence. A legal way to remove the board. Entirely. It was time to rebuild the community. From the ground up, the exposé was over. But the real revolution was about to begin. The days that followed the explosive meeting felt electric. The silence that once hung over the neighborhood was replaced with a current of conversation. Neighbors talking again, parents exchanging plans, even the more cautious residents now daring to hope for change. The illusion of power the HOA board once held had shattered. Margaret's name, once spoken with forced respect, had become a cautionary tale whispered across driveways. Daniel, however, remained focused. Exposing the corruption wasn't enough. The community needed structure and leadership that represented everyone, not just a handful of self-serving elites. The bylaws gave residents the power to call for a special election with signatures from 1/3 of homeowners. So that became his mission. He spent his evenings walking door to door, explaining the process, answering questions, and calming fears. Some people hesitated, afraid of retaliation. Others signed eagerly, ready to take back control. Even those who had once supported the board began to realize that the HOA's purpose was to protect property values, not to police families. Within 4 days, Daniel had gathered more than enough signatures. The request for a special election was filed, officially and legally binding. The board had no choice but to comply. Their grip on power was slipping faster than they could react. Margaret, of course, tried to fight it. She sent another flurry of emails, claiming Daniel was destabilizing the community and creating unnecessary conflict. But the damage was already done. Her allies on the board stopped replying to her messages. The property manager quietly began cooperating with Daniel's requests. For the first time, Margaret was truly alone. When the day of the special meeting arrived, the community clubhouse was filled again, this time with an unmistakable air of anticipation rather than anger. Parents came with their kids. Retirees came with clipboards. Even the HOA's own accountant showed up, sitting quietly near the back, as if to distance himself from the crumbling regime. The board members looked uneasy at the front of the room. They went through the motions, roll call, agenda, acknowledgments, until Daniel stood up and presented the petition. The property manager confirmed its validity. The vote would proceed immediately. One by one, the homeowners marked their ballots. It was a moment of collective empowerment. Neighbors taking ownership of their community for the first time in years. The count was swift and decisive. Margaret and her allies were voted out by an overwhelming margin. For a moment, the room was silent, stunned by the weight of what had just happened. Then spontaneous applause broke out. It wasn't the loud, raucous kind of victory cheer. It was something deeper, a sigh of relief that had been building for years. Margaret stood frozen, her eyes blank before gathering her papers and walking out without a word. The heavy door closed behind her with a final echoing thud. In her place, the community voted in a new board, composed mostly of parents and longtime residents who had grown tired of being ignored. And at their urging, Daniel accepted the role of community legal advisor. Not because he wanted power, but because he wanted to make sure abuse like this never happened again. That evening, the new board's first act was to reinstate full pool access for all residents, regardless of age. A new sign was posted at the gate. "Welcome, families." As Daniel walked home, he could hear laughter echoing faintly from the pool area, children splashing again, parents chatting, the sound of community being restored. But he knew the story wasn't over yet. Because while Margaret was gone, people like her rarely disappeared quietly. Something told him she wasn't finished. Not yet. The following weeks were peaceful, almost too peaceful. The sun blazed over the freshly reopened pool, where children laughed, families gathered, and the sound of splashing water replaced the tense silence that had once defined the neighborhood. For the first time in months, people smiled freely again. The community felt whole. But Daniel had been around long enough to know that victories like this rarely came without a final ripple. And that ripple arrived one humid July morning, folded neatly in a plain white envelope taped to his door. It wasn't from the HOA. It was from an attorney's office. Inside was a formal letter. Margaret had filed a defamation claim against him and the newly elected board, accusing them of character assassination, emotional distress, and reputational damage. She demanded reinstatement, compensation, and a public apology. It was bold, desperate even, but Daniel had expected it. She wasn't fighting for justice anymore. She was fighting for relevance. He read the letter twice, then calmly placed it on his desk. Margaret had no case. Every statement he made had been factual, backed by documents and recorded meetings. What she called defamation was simply the truth. And truth, Daniel knew better than anyone, was an unbreakable defense. Still, he treated the matter seriously. The new board deserved closure, not another drawn-out conflict. So he prepared a detailed response. Formal, professional, airtight. He cited every legal precedent, every protection afforded to community members under state HOA law. He attached evidence of Margaret's financial misconduct, her procedural violations, and her misuse of HOA funds. When her lawyer received the reply, the silence that followed said everything. There was no counter-argument, no second letter. Margaret's claim vanished quietly, withdrawn before it even reached court. Her final attempt to regain control had crumbled under the same weight of truth that had destroyed her presidency. After that, she sold her house. The for sale sign went up one Friday morning, and by Sunday it was gone, along with her car, her arrogance, and the shadow she had cast over the neighborhood. No one saw her leave, but no one really needed to. Her absence was its own closure. As the weeks passed, the neighborhood began to heal. The board, now guided by fairness rather than fear, introduced community days, open forums, and transparent budgeting. Parents volunteered for maintenance projects. Retirees hosted morning gatherings by the pool. The place that had once been divided by rules and resentment was finally united by trust. On a warm August evening, Daniel walked his daughters to the pool. The air was still, golden in the late daylight. Emily and Grace raced ahead, their laughter echoing across the water as they jumped in. The new sign at the gate gleamed under the sun. Simple words, but full of meaning. Community pool for everyone. Daniel sat back on a bench, listening to the rhythm of the water and the hum of life around him. He hadn't just defended his family's right to swim. He'd reminded an entire community what it meant to stand up for one another. Justice, he thought, didn't always come in a courtroom. Sometimes it came in small ripples. One act of courage that changed everything. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the pool lights flickered on, casting a soft glow across the water. Daniel watched his daughters play, the faint laughter of neighbors floating through the warm air. The war was over. The community was free. And for the first time in a long time, peace truly felt earned. The pool had never looked more beautiful.